start on that HTML.
Okay, better mute that or it's gonna be really weird. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that it's kind of required, but I'm still really grateful. I'm excited to see all of you. My name is Camille Martin Thompson. I am the Assistant Dean of the School of Design. I'm also a professor. I get to teach in interior design. I typically teach an undergraduate studio there, and I teach in art and design education, a graduate seminar on college teaching. So why am I here? For the past several years, we've been engaged in doing some research on critique. And my collaborator, Gaia, and I have been working on critique at every different level, the student experience, the faculty experience, how it can be modified, how it can be perfected. I was thinking this morning of my first experience with critique, and my default, I didn't mention, so I'm an architect by training and practice. I have a practice here in New York. And I always think that my first experience with the crit is undergrad architecture school, both of my degrees, undergrad and grad architecture. And then I remembered that I was part of a traveling performance group from the time I was 9 until I was 15, singing. And every year, once a year, we had to sing 8 bars a cappella in order to be evaluated and ranked. And I realized that that experience and that kind of critique prepared me in a way for architecture critiques that I experienced later on. So I'm going to kick it over to the most extraordinary professor and collaborator I know, Gaia Wang.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gaia Huang. I co-coordinate and I'm a full-time in the graduate communication design department. I, as Camila said, have been doing a lot of research on practices in the classroom and scholarship, what is called scholarship of teaching and learning, with a stronger focus on peer review and critique. Camila and I have been collaborating for many years now, and out of this we became friends, and we keep on collaborating, and we will. Why we're leading this conversation about critique, because we want to present a little bit of the basic about critique, but also the forefront of what is coming and how pedagogies are changing. So Camille is going to share her screen with the slides we are sharing. And with us today, we have some panelists that are going to help us answering some of the questions that we have put together from input from students and some of the questions that you will answer. So first panelist, maybe we can, Erica, can you introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Henricks. I'm the chairperson of undergraduate architecture. I've been at Pratt over about 20 years now, but within the administration for at least 10 years. And I'm really excited to be here today and to share thoughts on the nature of critique.
James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm James Lippaback. I'm the coordinator of visualization and representation. I also teach visualization and representation in the foundations department at Pratt, along with light, color, and design. So I might see some of you soon. I'm happy to be here and share some of my thoughts about critiquing.
And Fola, I think I saw you here somewhere. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Fola Abdul Jabbar. I'm a postgraduate teaching fellow in the writing program, where I teach electives and senior thesis. I'm excited to be here and talk to you all about critiquing and workshopping, and yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I am going to start our slideshow. Gaia is going to move somewhere where there's more stable internet. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so here are all of our names in case you want to write something down, or so you can find us later for an email. We'll put this slide back up again a bit later. So let's define critique. And I don't want to make assumptions about what you do or don't know about critique. I know that many of you have probably had some kind of experience with critique, formalized or informal. and that some of you may not have experience with critique. So let's just come up with a basic definition that can span a lot of different methods and modes and types of critique. It's an assessment or evaluation of a student's work at a particular point in time. So this could be any particular point in time. You might be asked to show your work to your instructor or class, an individual peer, or even guests for a final review. A lot of students are really familiar with the formalized end of project review, but critique is also something that can happen at any point in a project or a process. So you might hear it called a workshop or a mid-crit, a pin-up, a mid-review, any other terminology. They refer to all the same thing, which is basically an in-process crit.
We ask each other a lot, what is critique about besides evaluating the work? And we usually use this definition. We say that critique is the search to discover what has happened in the work and why is that work relevant to the larger context of design. So critique is not just an evaluation of a piece in itself, but is really a discovery about how that piece, whatever form it takes, related to the larger context and a larger word and discourse of the design subject you're working in.
So most importantly, critique is a vehicle through which students have an opportunity to supplement visual or written work that's being presented by articulating a position about that work in a dialogue, usually in a conversation. There are some exceptions to this, and we'll discuss that later.
So one of the things that we often suggest to students is that critique is not something that happened to you. It feels sometimes something that kind of you were have to subscribe to, but it's not something that you can use. But in actual fact, it's something that is yours. You can make it yours by reclaiming the way critique is done and by using it to kind of get the feedback you need, and not only the feedback that your faculty is interested in giving. So there are many different ways to do critique in a way that is active and that allow you as a student to have agency in that. The fact a critique that belongs fully to the faculty and is something that is dumped on you is a very old model. It existed, and sometimes it survives in certain contexts, but critique is developing as a dialogue between student and faculty more and more. So you will be exposed in many different ways, but in general, don't think of critique as something you are subjected to, but it's something that you can really reclaim and that will help you develop a way of talking about your creative work and develop your visual and spoken fluency.
So the more you can sort of take a step back from critique as an assignment and understand that critique is a process by which, like Gaia is saying, you can develop as a creative person in your creative discipline, the more you're going to feel like critique is actually for you. So sometimes your instructor are going to have specific goals for critique. Some of them are goals that are benchmarking established by a syllabus, so where someone is in, work product process. But whether or not these goals are specifically articulated, we really strongly feel that students should establish their own goals for critique whenever possible. And I'll explain something that I used to do both in undergrad and grad school that really helped me recenter myself and my own work and my own process in the critique, even though I wasn't making the decisions about when the crit was going to happen or what the format was. So I would always have goals for myself for the crit, and also questions that I wanted to make sure I asked the respondent if it was appropriate, like if it wasn't a silent crit. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I don't think they're awesome examples. We can talk about this a little bit later. So pretend you're an interior design student on a mid-review for a community center project. You could end, so typically, let me also frame this a little bit. Typically in a review like that, you'll be able to have a few minutes where you get to explain what your project is and what the goals are. And after that spiel of what it is, I would always give the jury a few questions. I would say, I specifically would like feedback on my use of color material, or how circulation is operating, or if my line weights are communicating in my drawings effectively. Any additional feedback you would like to give me would really be appreciated. Or, if that's too sort of abstract, you could say, if you're trying to use impasto as a way of exploring texture and conveying movement, you could say, can I have feedback on how to use this more effectively? And so then you're posing the question to your critics before they can start posing the questions back to you. And sometimes they'll respond directly and sometimes they won't, but at least from their feedback, you can sort of read between the lines of whether or not you are working on your goals or progressing in that manner.
So critique doesn't always involve the faculty. Sometimes, and that's a classic example is peer review, faculty are not present and they're not part of the critique. Peer review is actually one of the most important practice of higher education. It's a very high impact practice. We suggest you to involve in peer review as much as you can. And so you will not only receive feedback in a critique from faculty and peers, but you also need to learn to provide feedback yourself to other peers of yours, or in a group, or individually, in different level of intimate relationship, meaning friends you know very well, or peers you just met. So there are many different ways. There are some technique that basically will help you navigate how to give feedback in an efficient way and in a way that is constructive to your peers. We're not going to talk about it today, but I'm going to drop a handout that is going to be emailed to you anyway, to all of you. So if you're watching this on YouTube, don't worry, you'll get that by email. But there is a handout that help you navigate how to give feedback to your peers. Yes. So there are many different ways of doing critique. This is where Camille and I research came in. Some years ago, we started collecting different ways, like different kind of practices that were across campus in different departments, and collect a catalog of different ways to do critique. We're going to present some of them. Some of them are very obvious. Some of them might be new to you. And this is just to give you an idea that there are many different ways of doing critique. And so you might encounter them and you might propose to do them differently. You might organize yourself with your peer to do them in certain ways. And this to give you a sense of how complex the topic of critique is. And here comes the animals, because in case you were falling asleep, the slides are going to become more fun now. So the first critique method we're talking about is called self-critique. Self-critique is an intentional self-reflective practice that helps you evaluating your work based on a set of criteria that you decide. It's not just like thinking about what you're doing, but it's really about setting criteria and look at your own work and try to understand if you met the criteria you set for yourself. Self-critique is important because it has different pedagogical implications, meaning that for first, the fact that you get ownership on your own learning. So you are responsible to create a benchmark for yourself, and that helps really developing the way we relate with our work. It also teach self-reliance and teach students and also faculty and designer or artists at large, creative at large, to be the critical expert in the room and be critical of their own practice.
Why isn't it advancing? Oops. Okay, so desk critique is an informal dialogue around a desk in a studio or a workshop. The working space of a student can say something about the work and create a deeper connection between the faculty and student. The desk critique enables a conversation without the pressure of a public audience. So you won't have a group of people listening in on a conversation. It's really just between you and your instructor, or maybe two people and the instructor, so it's quite intimate. A lot of students, there is some research about how students respond to different types of critique. And there is some research, particularly around architecture, that the desk critique often yields a higher level of production, meaning sort of more targeted response to feedback than other types of critique. So it'll be used quite a bit in a lot of disciplines. You can also think of this as being a studio visit. So for those of you who are studying fine arts, you might refer to this as a studio visit. I know there's a lot of other terminology for desk critique, but just think of it as being a really personal conversation, usually a one-on-one between an instructor and you.
Freestyle battle. This is a strange one. Freestyle battle is basically a tournament where the work that gets produced, that usually is an improvisational work, get to be voted best and win a very symbolic prize. And usually freestyle battle are like judged by the larger group that's present, and it is a place where you can render your work as a performance and made to entertain and make fun of the work itself. And there's this level of freedom and the kind of irony and like self-irony in it. It also creates a suspended reality where all the participants can take center stage. Think ballroom culture, if you're familiar with, think Pose, if you're familiar with TV series, that's a freestyle battles. Think rap battles and this type of events that can be done in the classroom. I used to do it an improvised poster graphic design battle that student would put together poster like on the fly, and then other student would make noise to vote the best. It's obviously an ironic critique because improvisation is usually not like the highest quality work get produced in improviser, but it's come with fun and come with this freedom that is creating a space that is safe.
I always think of that movie Pitch Perfect, you know, with them singing at each other as the freestyle battle. And I would love to see that in design school. I have no idea what that would look like, but it would be cool. So the next one is pinup. And Gaia and I argue about the definition of a pinup. We've been arguing for what, 4 or 5 years now about what a pinup is. And the reason why is because pinup is a term that can be very discipline specific. Like, it is not just a method of putting work up on a wall for evaluation, but it can also sort of have other codes and meanings embedded in it. So for our basic purposes, generally we'll say a pinup is a critique of work that's been intentionally arranged, visible, and displayed on a surface. It's usually a wall, but we'll just say on a surface. The use of pinup implies that arranged display of a body of work furthers the understanding of it. So it's not haphazardly placed. It's placed with some level of intention by the author of that work. Gaia, you want to add anything to pinup?
No. All right, so the next one is one that is very, very relevant. That is an asynchronous critique. Asynchronous critique is the critique that focuses on accessibility by facilitating feedback outside the constraint of time. You might have thought that an asynchronous critique as like a product of like our remote class and online learning, but it's actually a practice that has been used. And if you think about it, it comes with advantages. First, this ability to set itself outside the constraint of time. It allows more time to spend in both providing feedback and reflecting on the provided feedback. So you can return back to that feedback multiple times at different points and get the most out of it. So it has his pedagogically advantage, and it's not just a product of this new ways of teaching and learning.
Gaia, I really love how you created all these slides with animals. I find it really interesting to look at. And props on tenure. The next one is a shout out. A shout out is a short positive comment or reference designed to highlight a talent or contribution about the work. So it's a way of giving positive reinforcement about the work within a group context that is also kind of a freestyle sort of, what am I trying to say? It's really spontaneous, actually, and it's a way of building positive reinforcement about the work. And it's particularly useful if there are positive things about the work that you can't identify yourself. So it can be used as an icebreaker of sorts. It can be used in combination with other types of critique. And it's a really good way of sort of breaking the ice between peer groups as well.
I agree. If I can add something on shout out, like if you think of shout out, for example, if your faculty asks you to list the 10 things that are great about the work of another, that's a shout out, because if everybody lists all the positive things, so what gets not talked about is usually what's not great. So the question, the point of shout out, and actually we call it shout out, but it's also called affirmative inquiry. Affirmative inquiry is like the affirmation of good things that the work has. Is an interesting way of doing critique. It seems counterproductive because when you say critique, we think of being critical, but we can be critical by being positive constantly. So it's an interesting way of doing critique. And that's Camille's favorite. Oh no, it's my turn. Oh, right. So the next one is jury, my least favorite of them all. Sorry. You see, Camille and I, we spend a lot of time analyzing this critique technique. So we have perseverance and so jury, my favorite one, sarcastically, is a formal critique, very, very common. It's usually led by a jury of faculty, clients, experts, professionals, end user of a product, anyone who has been authoritative in the topic. It reinforced that relationship, the dominant expert novice relationship in higher education. So you assume that expert has a lot more to say about the work than everybody else, and it reinforced. And that's sometimes true, and sometimes not. So jury has a different level of success depending on the juror, of course. It's a very classic practice of critique. It can be done great in an amazing way, don't get me wrong.
Round robin is a term that you will hear used in a couple of different ways. So I'll describe it. It can be much like a science fair, if you're familiar with that terminology, meaning that a person stands adjacent to their work, or a group of people adjacent to the work, and a group of reviewers will go to each person and give feedback on that work. It's also described sometimes as someone making a presentation and every single person in the audience giving feedback. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about it more as the science fair type of format. So it's a display of projects or project results with a rotating group of jurors. The great advantage to a round robin is that every participant, so every author, artist, design student, will get the same number of feedback because the group of jurors rotates equally to each one of them. It's also a really great way of practicing your pitch. So you get an opportunity over and over again to talk about what you think your work is about, get feedback about that work, and then even edit or curate your pitch for the next group of people who comes by.
Panel. So panel is a technique used a lot in conferences and seminars, but it's also a critique technique. And it's basically a discussion of the work that position the person who produced the work, so the student in the role of expert among peers, among other experts. So when someone who has produced the work gets treated as a peer by a group of other experts, then it's offering the opportunity to have full ownership of their work and their practice. That can be done in different moments of the path across a project. We, in our graduate department, we use it as a final thesis. What was once a defense, now is not defense anymore. So you don't defend your thesis, you're part of a panelist of experts talking about your topic. And it allows students to take fully ownership of the conclusion of their thesis and their path.
Sorry, that was an accident.
That's all okay. You can go for our last one.
So peer review is the method, probably I can safely say that Gaia and I both enjoy the most, because it's feedback that students can give to each other, or professionals can give to each other. Any peer can give it to another peer, and it removes layers of hierarchy from the feedback that's being given. You'll find out, and I'm sure you have in previous educational experiences, that you're going to learn as much, if not more, from each other than you will from your instructors in many cases. And so peer review gives that opportunity for that level of feedback with someone else who might be struggling with the same set of questions about their work. I think that's it. Anything else?
That's it. And I think now we're going to start asking the question we collected before this meeting to the panel. Camille is going to ask them to the panel while I'm going to manage the chat. So if you have any question that you want to add, I see that some of you already posted some. I'm going to collect them, group them, and then ask them. If you want them to post publicly, you can post it to everyone. If you want them anonymous, you can post it to me and I will anonymize them for you.
And you can also feel free to write in the chat if you want to voice the question yourself. You can also write to us and then you can just say it yourself directly. So panel, are you ready? Okay, Erica, I'm just wondering, do I need to be scared of critique? And what if I'm uncomfortable with public speaking? I mean, real talk, I actually am uncomfortable in public speaking, even though I have to do it every single day of my life. So how should I handle public critique and presentation?
Excellent question. Well, I think one of the things that we should probably all remember is that we're here to learn. And one of the things is learning is just experiencing things. So, and I remember when I first did this, I was the shyest person on the planet when I was in school. And I still to this day have to do a lot of preparation when I speak in public. But with that said, we just have to, or find a way to begin and to allow ourselves to be, you know, a little nervous because it is a new experience. And I think that being slightly uncomfortable is absolutely normal. The other thing too is that in the class, we can also be supportive of each other during this process because everybody's going to be new at this. So a little bit of like the shout out, like, come on, you know, Camille, you can do this, or Guy, I really like that work, but I think you've got this, you know, so we can begin to support each other within the collective studio. You know, I think it's always, it's one of these things that we also need to rely on the fact that we need to begin to practice how we want to focus our work, you know, as mentioned about the idea of determining a goal, or like, what are the goals of this assignment and what we're talking about. That also takes some skill. And so, but then also, as you have the faculty, you're beginning, you know, within the everyday lesson, you're beginning to shape how you speak about your work all the time. So I would just also encourage, when we start the class in, let's say, informal capacities, it also would be good to just begin to respond with the faculty member as like they're asking a simple question. So in some ways, it really becomes a way to begin to open up the conversation by just beginning to experience your sharing of an opinion within that environment. It should just be something that you should understand, that the space of the classroom is also a safe one. And as we begin, it's starting to develop our skills. And that's just really important. And really remember, in the most humble sense, we all had to do this at the first time. All of us together had to start the first time. And every time we do it, we get better at it. It's just the same as doing a drawing. We're refining our skills. As we speak about our work, we're getting better at the articulation. It's really practice to be able to be fluent. And it just starts from day one. And it's okay to make a mistake.
That's really beautifully stated, Erica. I totally agree with you. And I will say from personal experience that practice helps desensitize you from the fear around the speaking. It becomes more normalized in that way. How about anyone else? Do you have a comment about public speaking, James or Philip?
I'll just add that, I mean, in writing at least, I think a lot of people are moving away from thinking about things as being like right or wrong or good and bad. So there shouldn't be any fear that you're going to be, you know, labeled as having done something incorrectly or poorly, because that's not really what it's about. It's just about seeing what's happening with what you've created and having a conversation about it. And I think what Erica was saying was like, really right, really poignant. Part of the process of critique is every time you do it, you learn about how you like doing it and how you like having those types of conversations. And that's very, very valuable.
I would also add that all your instructors know that this is new. And I, for one, start real low stakes. We do simple things just to start slow. So I think you don't need to be afraid of walking into something really intense that first few weeks. You're going to learn as you go, and they're going to help you along the way.
Yeah, and the point really is practice, not perfection. Okay, next question. What if my work is unfinished and I feel unprepared for critique and I don't want to show up that day, or I don't want to show my work? What do I do? Oh, sorry, this question is for Fulla.
You should, this is great following the fears discussion. This should not be a fear that anyone should really have. Mostly just because like the idea of finished work is flexible. And ideally in a critique format, there is something that has room to be discussed. So the thing that should be finished is what you want to talk about and how you want to explore what you have, whether or not it is, you know, a exhibition worthy object or a publication worthy piece of writing is not really the point of critique. Usually you're talking about in-process work, and it's almost better, in my opinion, to feel like your work has room to grow, because then you are more open to having a discussion about it. So the preparation should be emphasized more towards, I think, the how you want to talk about it, what's the discussion, rather than like simply the product or project itself.
Thanks, Fulla. We often talk in scholarship of teaching and learning circle. So we're talking about pedagogy, about the simultaneous development of the person, the product, and their process, and that all three are working at the same time in order to assist you as a learner. And so critique is one of those signature pedagogies, we call it. So I'll just say it's a really important moment in your educational process where you get to develop your process about your work, the physical product about the work, whatever that is, and also your personhood simultaneously. So that's why it's like such an important practice and one that we lean on a lot in art and design. Erica, James, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's also really important is, you know, what Fulla addressed, to follow up on that, is that it is in process. And even if there are things that are not quite finished, whether it's text-based or drawing-based or model or three-dimensional, what have you, there may still be information or things to discuss. I think one of the worst things that can happen is that you may not, let's say, like miss the class, because in some way being present to actually listen is really valuable, to listen to what is being discussed and to actually see the examples that are being, like what is the work that's being discussed, whether it's text or visual, so that it actually still helps the process of learning. So that's just really one of the things that's important to remember, is that the discussion, the visualization, the experience of the learning process is just extremely important.
James?
Yeah, I would add to that and say that this will be the first time that you guys have done these things, but it's not the first time that we've done them. So we've seen students not finish things, and we've been in the position where we have not finished things ourselves, where we're stuck, where we're confused. And I actually find it really, really helpful to be able to speak to that. I mean, if you bring something in that you're struggling with, there's actually quite a bit that we can talk about with how to get you back on track. That is, for me, completely anecdotal, because these are personal struggles that we all go through, and I think engaging in that is helpful for your peers, because everybody can relate to it. And what Erica said, like, the worst thing you can do is to not come to class. Like, participating is what we're doing, and especially at such a strange time that we're in. Everybody is very empathetic with each other, and we're here to help. And I think the unfinished work is a time when we can be the most helpful in many ways.
Thanks, James. I would also say that I think that by not showing up or showing the work, you're robbing yourself of an opportunity for personal growth and development, and to get additional feedback about that work. So it's one of those things where if you're in a critique and you're not getting positive feedback, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily negative feedback. It's informative feedback. And if you're in a critique and you get even negative feedback, it isn't necessarily destructive feedback. So it's kind of important to be able to get to a point in your process as a creative person where you're able to take all of that feedback in and then make decisions for yourself about how to carry on with the work and approach it after that. Sorry. So James, I'm wondering, what if I feel a critique was unfair or biased in some way? What do I do?
This is a tough one. I thought what Gaia said about the critique is yours is really important. That you need to take agency and know that it's your right to get the feedback that you want. So Camilla asked about an anecdote that I have from critique. And I thought of one that was not, that I thought dovetailed with this nicely, which is I was a freshman in college and I was making a big giant drawing that I stayed up all night working on. And the professor said that, the drapery looked like mashed potatoes. And it was so crushing. And at the time, like, I just took it. But then I was like, he was a teacher. I still don't know what was wrong with that drawing to this day. I don't have it anymore. And it really has informed the way that I critique, because, and informed the discussion that we have at Pratt about ways to be helpful for students. And I thought that he was being unfair, because what you need to do is find out how you can be better and how you can improve. And I know that we have a very empathetic faculty, and that we want to be helpful, and to be able to say, well, whether, unfair, I'd say in that instance, it was unfair, not necessarily biased, but being comfortable saying to the professor later, hey, can you tell me more? I don't know what that meant. That was hurtful. I don't understand what you were trying to mean, what you meant by that. Could you give me some concrete tips to improve this?
Sorry, I muted myself, which I did not mean to do. I think that's a really great response, James. I think it's probably safe to say that at some point in your career, in your academic career, your professional career, you're going to get a critique that you feel is unfair. Not necessarily biased, but unfair. And it's going to be really important for you to tease out if a negative critique is always an unfair one, or just someone that is disagreeing with your point of view in the work. If you feel as though you really are experiencing a biased critique, and I mean one that could come from a peer or from a faculty member or someone else, it's really important to speak about that. So what do I mean by that? I think the first thing that one can do, so let's pretend you're in a review and you feel as though a peer has said something really biased in the critique. You have every right to ask for clarification about that statement. You have every right to speak about it to your professor. You have every right to then speak about it to your chairperson. The chairperson will notify someone in the dean's office, so it could be me or the dean or the dean of your respective schools. But what you should also note is that we have something on campus, it's called BERT, which is a Bias Education Response Team. So if you feel as though you're getting a critique that's unbiased from a faculty member in the classroom, you can also report it to BERT. And if you go on the Pratt website and you search for BERT, you'll find a form that's a evaluation response form. You fill that out and you send it away. So that can also be used for bias, discrimination, sexual misconduct, all of those things. And I'm sure they're talking to you a lot about that in other orientation sessions, so I'll leave it there. But I think that it is really important to, sometimes there's a fine line. It's like, oh, did this person not respond to my work because of something that has to do with my personhood and not the work itself? Or is it just that they're not responding to my work, in which case that's fair, even though it feels unfair, and I can move on and make my own decisions about how to move forward in the work. Gaia, do you have anything else to add? Nope, all good.
Oh, can I add something to?
Oh, please.
I just wanted to say, I think like something that a lot of students don't often realize, that if you receive feedback and a critique that you don't like or you don't think is quite fair, you don't have to listen to it. It's your work. And nothing somebody says can change your work and the way that you know, create art. That's different from offensive feedback. And I also think it's important, you know, whenever you feel safe, is to go into certain situations with compassion. And sometimes people say things that, you know, are hurtful without knowing it. So if there's room, both on the creative side and on the feedback side, use that as a space for conversation. Like, oh, well, I perceive that as, rather than making it a space of conflict too quickly.
That was so well stated. Thank you.
And could I add to that as well? One thing that I also, back to an earlier comment on like the nature of constructive criticism, or how to actually suss out what the critics will primarily be focusing on is to listen to how you describe the project and respond to the work that's being pinned up. And oftentimes they are going to probably speak to things that can be better or what can be worked on. And sometimes with new students and new ears hearing, it may be harder, you know, to suss out the fact that that support of like what you can do better is about that positive engagement. It's about responding to things that can help the work or the text read better to support your conceptual strategies or your goals. Sometimes, and when I've seen critics on panels, sometimes they forget to share or give a little bit of a shout out. They may kind of go right to what you can do better. But so it's just trying to suss out that difference, but it's still positive. It's still trying to help and support the work. So.
I was on mute. Thank you so much, Erica. So this last question before we go over to the questions from the audience is, can you give us an example of advantages of remote critiques? Actually, I'm lying, there's 2 questions. So I'm gonna kick this off to the panel asking Erica, can you give us an example of advantages of remote critique?
Sure, I had to unmute. From over in the School of Architecture, since the spring, I participated in a group of faculty in the summer where we all experimented with the online critique. And one of the things that, or using Miro and using other online platforms. And one of the things that was the feedback was through the through that process, we were actually able to see more of the students' work because it had to be more shared versus sort of the traditional models of just seeing the individual desk crit, meaning like the faculty is just seeing the work on the computer screen, versus having a broader discussion where everybody could see the work. So the learning experience and the experiential part of it was really enhanced. And it also allowed, I think in the way that we want to understand our practice, to begin to actually participate in an environment that became a little bit, in a strange way, kind of intimate on the screen, where there's a small group of people. And in some ways, it actually provided somewhat of an equitable environment as well, because it didn't sort of, the faculty, square was just in there with everybody else. So it just became part of a group, and it didn't really become like hierarchical in a way. So it had a little bit more about like a studio culture, as we call it in the School of Architecture, where there's a kind of engagement, as a kind of an equitable participant, so to speak. And I think that was one of the things that came out of what we saw that was really interesting. And plus everybody could hear each other very clearly. It wasn't like, and so everybody felt involved.
Thanks. How about Fulla or James?
I think like there are, any different medium has its own like advantages and disadvantages. I think remote critiquing or workshopping, as we usually call it, workshopping and writing, is interesting because like it's not a common experience to just like be in someone's making space as you're looking at the work. So that can be a really useful thing. Like the studio is always there. Similarly with like Zoom formats, the screen sharing is really interesting because like the author has more control about how we see a text and when we see certain things. And if they're doing like three-dimensional work, like literally like how we view something is entirely up to the maker's control. So like you have a lot more ability to guide the discussion than you would in the classroom. And then just like, in a less like intellectual level, I think like there's something like stiffening about the classroom that makes people really nervous because it's already kind of like an anxiety inducing thing when you're like on the spot like that. But when you're comfortable and you have your cat and your coffee, and like I think people are more open to like have real conversations about their work, and I think that that's actually been very nice.
I will say my cat is nothing but a critique disruptor. Really reasonable demands for treats right in the middle when I'm trying to say something that I think is profound. James, anything else to add there?
I would just add that there's lots of different forms of critique that we have discussed today, but in the classroom, I think that particularly with foundation studio classes, it's often a teacher-centered critique. And I think that's unfortunate. In my own classroom, I'm always seeking ways to make it more about peer review and self-reflection, and to have all these different levels of critique that happen throughout the process. And remote critiques really has allowed for a lot of those different modalities to come into the classroom pretty organically. Before I kind of found it hard to kind of work things in because I plan the 6 hours and I'm just going. And I feel like remote teaching has allowed for a lot of really nice things like breakout rooms and Slack and Discord and all these other elements that really give us opportunities for like the shout out. I feel like there's a lot of nice ways that you can give each other feedback really quickly. It doesn't have to be so heavy and soul crushing, which it can be sometimes in class.
I totally. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, James.
No, I'm excited. I think this semester is going to be awesome because I think the critiques are going to be so much better. It's good.
Oh, wait. Oh, why am I so bad at this? Okay, so the last question, Gaia is posing to all of us, and I'll start it, is 2020 has changed the world, so how did it change critique? I think that a lot of the ways critique has been changed in 2020 are things that the panel just addressed, but I think that 2020 has made us all more aware of the conditions of critique that we used to just take as sacrosanct or given, and that there was no other way to do it. So critique has to happen in person. Oh, well, not really necessarily. Critique has to happen in person in front of a panel of experts, and there's a particular choreography to the spatial arrangement of the student and the experts. It's like, oh, well, no, just like Erica was just saying, critique on a platform like Zoom can be kind of a great equalizer because everyone has the same rectangle in the space, and the only hierarchy is created by who is listed as a host or co-host. So at the beginning of this, for example, I changed all the panelists to co-hosts so you could see our faces pretty easily while we were all speaking. So it's upended some of these assumptions about how we're teaching, how we're learning, what the cadence and choreography of critique is. And I think that's actually really powerful. The other thing about critique in 2020 is that, and this isn't the case for everyone, I don't want anyone thinking I assume this is the case for all disciplines, but in a lot of ways, students aren't having to rely on really cost prohibitive production means in order to get feedback about the work. So this could often mean really expensive and very large plots, for example, that one no longer needs to produce in order to get feedback about the work because it's happening on a screen. It might be a PDF. Some projects may have supplanted a 3D physical model, again, which is sometimes cost prohibitive with something that's digital. So it's a really interesting space to be in. Teaching this semester is going to be quite different than last semester because we're preparing differently, but some faculty are relying more on found objects within a student's home or surrounding environment that are easy to get than going to an art supply store, fabric supply store, something that's really quite expensive. So in that way, I think it's important, but it also reminds us that critique is not happening in a bubble. So, and it never was, but the isolation within a classroom lets us pretend that the academy is operating within a bubble without sort of outside constraints or factors. The thing is, crit is now happening in our homes or in other spaces or other people's homes. And there are sometimes cats walking across keyboards, or sometimes siblings who need attending to, or sometimes a partner who's in the space who's making noise because of their own work, or any number of things. So it's a way of also, you know, we think of critique as being this disembodied practice where a person has to be sort of teased out separately from their work. Actually, the online space sort of brings it back together in a really interesting way and can create some really positive tensions. But what else do you all think about that? I'll stop talking, I talk a lot.
I will add to this answer. So I think like 2020 has seen many events that are bound to bring change. The pandemic that obviously see us doing a lot of remote learning, but also have seen us coming to learning from a place of anxiety, anger, and trauma. The George Floyd protest, also the protests have led to many legislative proposals at different places and different levels that combat police misconduct and brutality, and that try to address the systemic racism. This isn't something that hasn't changed pedagogies. It has changed. What has that to do with higher education and critique? It does have a lot. There is now more than ever a focus on power and privilege and on policing practices. Like policing practices are common in classroom. You can think about them as pedagogical technique or technology that assume there is a adversarial relationship between student and teacher. And now is the time to rethink those practices more than ever, because we should have a class in which we trust each other and we come together in a trust and not in a policing mode. And then power, obviously, power at any level has been under scrutiny. Who has power? Who has privilege? What does it mean to have power and privilege? How can we change as student and faculty, as higher education participants, the society that is obviously structurally racist? And what is our role and the role of higher education in this change, and its change of itself as well? Higher education is also polluted to that, and it's change in its own structure. So what does that mean for critique? Camille and I wrote a paper recently. We say critique is a performance of power. It is a power game. It'll always be peer or faculty led. There's always a power dynamic. Observing those is something those dynamics of power is something very important, because critique is always framed within the personal and educational experience of the participants and the cultural context they are using. So critique is never neutral, it's a power dynamics, and 2020 is the perfect time to look at it from a different perspective.
If I could also add, I think one of the things that is also like during the process of critique, and I think with what Camille and Gaia pointed out very precisely in the 2020 environment, is that as educators, we're also in the process of modeling what that is and how to actually present a critique and really, or really understand how to speak about each other's work in a helpful way, to really understand how we can find the space of having a way to express each other as a safe environment where we can express our ideas and like the power dynamic is really, it's there, but it's also in a sense where that should also be seen as positive, where the instructor is guiding from their experience and their as educators to assist in that learning goal, you know. So it's really all in the process of supporting. And I think we may be seeing examples in our public space and environment where we're constantly hearing things that do not actually seem very productive, supportive. But I think where we are at school, we can try to allow our public officials to have that space out there, but at least we can practice being supportive and respectful of each other here at Pratt in our learning world.
Absolutely. Oh, James, you have something to add?
Yeah, if I can. I've been thinking about, you know, the role of the professor as the professional versus the student, that the difference is that I'm more comfortable with the mistakes that I make, or like I get like less thrown off because I do it all the time. Like I've made decades more mistakes than all of you. And there's a thing in improv, the basic tenet of improv. I don't know if anybody ever's done improv. I haven't, but I a lot of friends that do it. And the basic tenet is yes and, which is that you don't say no but. So if someone throws out a word from the audience that's a terrible idea, no one's allowed to be like, that's a terrible idea. You have to be like, yes and, this is funny. And that was my first response when we went into quarantine. It was like, we just need to be good to each other. And like, I can help my students by sharing, you know, what positive spin I put on that mistake when I made it. And that's really been my approach, is to just try to answer every question with a yes and an and.
Okay, so I love that actually. I try to think about my life that way, but it's difficult. So we're gonna open up.
Sorry.
Oh, Gaia, please take it away.
I have some questions from the chat. I think I would like to start with one of the most important question I've read, that is, why architects only wear black clothes?
I'm an architect and I'm not wearing black.
Well, you can deny that they do often though.
Well, yeah, it's true. I often have a black wardrobe, even though I'm in gray today. I think it's just like some people where they, may have a kind of uniform. It just becomes easy. My life is quite entailed, and so it's like I wake up in the morning and I can put things together and I can go on with my day. My only problem with that, if somebody would have gotten better at this years ago, it doesn't work when I'm on a construction site. So it's too bad it didn't get out there where it was like architects should be wearing beige or white just to make a sawdust and spackle dust environment, but we didn't actually get that memo. So I don't really know where it started, but
Thank you. We have another few questions. One is like, since art is quite personal, how do you go about a critique without hurting someone's feeling? What are some examples of offensive feedback and constructive feedback? Some of these examples are actually in the handout I posted before. I can post it again. There's a list of feedback that are not constructive, like error correction feedback, for example, but I think the panelists can definitely add to this question. So how do you not hurt someone's feeling, and what is offensive feedback versus constructive feedback?
About hurt feelings, I think it's sometimes really challenging because there's a difficult way of gauging what statement will hurt someone's feelings versus not hurt someone else's. But it does come to a core of respect. I think there needs to be a level of respect, and also thinking about what type of feedback you would want to hear. I mean, Pratt students like feedback, and Pratt students typically like very honest feedback, but there is a way of couching that free feedback in a way that isn't destructive, that isn't suggesting in a way that's leading. To Gaia's point, there is a handout that sort of helps with that vocabulary of feedback that centers work and that person instead of aspects of their personhood, or sort of takes away from the original impetus for ideation about the work. I think, Erica, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I think I think being at Pratt, because it is a creative environment, and it also, and with that, when you actually are making something, whether it's a drawing, a painting, a piece of sculpture, it does, just to remember, it does come from you as a creative individual. But I think just keep in mind is that the work that you're producing is meant to be seen as the assignment being done, and try to understand that it's really, we want to speak about the work, and try to learn to listen, that it's really the work that's being presented. And I know that it takes some time to actually understand that that's really the fundamental difference. And it may seem like it's personal, but what's being discussed is really intended to be about the composition, about if the line work is working, what if you tried this, right? So try to hear that difference, right? Because it's all of us as educators, it's not like you yourself is pinned up on the wall. That's not what is happening. But I think beginning to try to understand what is being said, and that's also really, the listening factor is also part of that skill set, as well as speaking. It's all integrated.
There is a follow-up question that goes in this conversation, that is, what do we do when someone cries or gets visibly upset due to a critique? What are the bystanders supposed to do? Do we ignore them, or do you ignore it, or should someone go? How would someone go about it? is kind of in this conversation, right? When that then happen, how should react?
I mean, that will happen. I think everybody will
Yeah.
be in a crit where this happens. And it might be for a couple of different reasons. Like sometimes I have students who are sharing work that is very personal in nature about traumas that experienced, and just discussing the work or sharing the work causes tears or causes an emotional reaction. And I think it's important. And then another way is they receive feedback that causes them to have a reaction like that. Both are okay and they happen. I like the latter is, not ideal. And hopefully that does not. But in any cases where it does occur, I feel like it's important to just like not shame the person for, something they can't control in that sense. But then once it feels appropriate, redirecting the conversation to the work. I think my experience with it is that the student who has that prefers that because they want to be perceived as an artist and as a creator, because we're there to have a serious discussion about your work. And because it's not the space to get into it, and there's resources that you can connect with that do deal with that, but the classroom is the classroom.
I think, it does happen. But I also think I would, in some ways, follow the lead of your faculty member. I've also seen where a student during a critique removed themselves to regain some composure and returned. And I was there as witness, and I sort of just spoke about trying to actually model again on the nature of just being respectful of understanding that people are reacting to a situation. It could also just be being tired or I didn't eat lunch. There could be other things that who knows. But the most important thing is to try to remember to be respectful of the student that may actually be having a bad day, and being supportive. And I think just remember that because it could happen to any one of us. And so as a community, it's just very important to just be helpful. Because actually sharing your creative enterprise takes some energy and it takes some risk. But to grow as a creative individual, risk is a part of it. And I think it's the way that we want to remember as educators to be absolutely supportive, whatever that means.
Thank you.
Always an opportunity to extend respect and grace to each other, no matter the context. And that goes for critique as well. I was having this conversation earlier today. You just never know what someone else is carrying around with them on any given day, what other circumstances. So they could be tired, they maybe didn't eat anything, they maybe are emotionally invested in the work in a way that's producing a really strong emotional response. I had a student once who started crying in the middle of her critique and excused herself, much like Erica was talking about, and came back and finished the critique. And afterward, when we were talking and I was asking if she felt that something being said was offensive or unfair, and she told me that her grandmother had just passed, but she wanted to continue and get a critique anyway and didn't want anyone to know. So frankly, you just really never know what's going on with someone. And we can always have an opportunity to give someone the benefit of the doubt.
I have a follow-up question that has been asked a lot, and I'm sure a lot of students want to know about it. So do critique correlates with grades, or how does critiquing affect their grades?
you want me to go first?
Sure.
Oh, sorry, Erica. Do you want to?
Oh, no. I mean, I could, you know,
Here's what
share.
all of you represent about 30 different disciplines at Pratt Institute.
Yeah.
And all of those disciplines are going to have different understandings and rule sets about the correlation between critique and grades. However, what I will say to you is that while critique is used as a way of assessing work at a particular point in time, it's not typically used as a grading criteria unless that is explicitly stated on your syllabus. So critique is a way of looking at where you are with the work, your own work, and also in comparison to your peers. So sort of understanding where the class is at in order to move the class forward. Or it's a method for us actually to benchmark where a class is at so that we can adjust our teaching methodology if necessary as well. But the grading criteria are what are explicitly stated on your syllabi, and critique typically isn't one of them. Erica, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think, and that's a good point, Camille, about paying attention to your syllabus where there is typically a grading and assessment, percentage of, like percentage of your grade is on assignment A, assignment B, and participation sometimes is which is a small percentage of your grade. However, just keep in mind is that when you for studio-based courses, the midterm presentation or the final presentation is really, it's really something that's all encompassing, which is primarily it's doing, it's the making of that assignment, which is the majority of the work, right? Because it's really fulfilling the goals of the assignment. And that's important, but it also is how you present the work, right? So it's all kind of embedded, but the majority of it is demonstrating the understanding of the assignment itself. So the demonstration through the assignment, whether it be text, making, whatever the deliverable is, that's primarily the assignment or what is being graded, but your participation in that process is part of it.
I think it really depends. In our research, we have seen very different critiques. Definitely when is the critique done? If it's project critique, definitely not linked to grade. This is final critique, as Erica is talking about. Could be depending on the class. Also depends typically, and this is not always true, but often the critics are not the one responsible for grade. Like the jury who's invited, the people that are invited to give you feedback are not the person that is responsible for your grade. The faculty is that person, and often that depends also on the class. I can speak for the entire institute, but often that faculty is more in the role of a coach and can filter out what the critique content is. Critics as faculty are human, so some of them are maybe not very constructive. It happens. We as faculty can filter out the comments that we know are not constructive to student that doesn't go into their grade at all. So usually there is this relationship and this tension in which the person who's responsible for your grade is the person who organized the critique, but is organizing it to add for your experience, to add more comments, add more thickness, more density to your experience, rather than as an evaluative mode. Usually when a critique is linked to your grade, you will know, that this, what's happening here is going to influence your grade. And that might be like a test or some form of more obviously critique, evaluative critique. But is, I think, rarely done by external invitees.
One other thing that I think should be important to note, particularly when there's the informal or the guest or like the desk critique, is also within the process of that advice from the faculty member. Try the methods that the faculty member is saying to do. Sometimes recommend, why don't you try to do this drawing like this, or go and look at something in the library and bring this in, so hopefully you're working with and gaining the kind of interaction that the guidance that the project is needed. So that exchange is also kind of important to build on. And that's also helpful.
A place where maybe it's linked is in a positive way of participation, meaning if you participate in peer critique, in adding something to the critique when it's a group critique, participation, that's often part of the grading. So it isn't really about what you say or how you conduct, but is the fact that you are contributing to the discourse that usually positively influence the grade. And I can see that's very, very common. So when you reclaim that critique is actually an increasing of grades.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, it's a really big part of understanding where students are at. Like Camille said, like benchmark for, so it's, if it affected a grade at all, it would be in a positive way. Like seeing that you know where the class is at and the objectives that we're trying to process, you're figuring out. And then your willingness to like engage in a positive way with the critique and the criticism and the suggestions, but not in a negative way. Generally speaking, critiques do not affect your grade in a negative way.
I would agree with, everything that you all are saying. And I think it varies honestly a lot between professor to professor, but like personally, I find it difficult to assign grades on like finished products because at a certain point it just becomes subjective. So the crit space or the workshop space is more of a place that I think about in terms of like, are you thinking about your work? Are you putting effort into it? Are you engaged in having a conversation about it? And that does affect grade. And in a way, it's like, it's comforting because you're not, when professors do that, you're not necessarily at the whim of like whatever they happen to like artistically.
I have another question from the group that is, for those who may not know the best way to present their work for critique in a professional and informative manner, do any of the panel members have tips for those students?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. For those who may not know the best way to present their work for critique in a professional and informative manner, do any of the panel have tips for those students? So how to present in a professional and informative way? Which are the tips and tricks for that?
Did the person say what discipline they're in?
No.
It's tricky.
I mean, for my own course, I'm going to discuss that at length in class, the beginning of class, and I'll explain my expectations. And like I said, we'll start with low stakes stuff. So I'm sending out an email to my students. Some of you might be them, and you'll get the email that's just going to give you like a little prompt to post something and say a short sentence about it. And that'll provide an opportunity to say like, I have a YouTube video about how to take nice photos with your iPhone, how to upload things, language, vocab, things that you'll use. So you'll be guided.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it really is something where the exchange of questions and answers with your faculty member in all of the disciplines will begin to actually create how to talk and listen about the work. All the faculty member will also oftentimes prepare. Let's say sometimes there'll be, we're gonna do let's say a mock presentation so we can learn, right? Or test it, see how we can speak about our work. So it's through the faculty, it's about building up skills. And so it just begins with additive experiences that help us get better at it. And so it's you know, at architecture, I see constant evolution throughout the 5 years of students evolving in the ability to be a better critic, and it's ongoing. It's not a quick thing. So.
As a communication designer, I can add a bit. We do a lot of presentations. I think no one starts, there's no recipe that you can follow and succeed at the beginning, because any presentation skills also depends on who you are and how you are going to narrate the story of what you're presenting. And it's really like a kind of a toolkit you pull together. I think one thing that I suggest is that there are plenty of examples out there that you come across. There are TED Talks, there are podcasts, there are conference panels, seminars, there are like comedy shows, like there are many, many ways. And the way to do it is like when you see something that you like as an audience and you think, this was really nice, then you want to note it down and think, how do I do that? I like when someone makes a joke in the middle of the presentation. I felt nice that there was a personal touch to it. I felt great that it was written and kind of like spoken slowly. I loved that it was visual in the background. Like all of these things you see that you perceive successful to you, take them and make it yours. Then they become your way of presenting. And to me, and I can, as usual, not speak for many other disciplines, but the best presentation are the ones that are crafted on your body. Like it's very hard to perform the ways of others, but there is a professionalism in how each of us present themselves. Discovering that is like part of the deal, and it's part of the opportunity of school, because you can fail a million times and it's not going to affect your grades, as we discussed before. So this defining and finding that voice is one of the most important things you have in the year you spend here.
Right. I mean, and I would emphasize that like experimentation, like it's a process that never stops. Like even all of us as professionals, we're constantly changing the way that we present our work, because the way that what you say about it will shape the conversation. And every time that you put it in front of somebody, you have to think to yourself, like, well, what do I want to say so that the conversation can be about this? Or so things that I don't know might happen can happen. And that can be fun. And you shouldn't put a lot of pressure on yourself in that sense. And I feel like in my experience, I don't know, I feel like there's not that many ways to do it poorly. Like anything is a good starting point. And I think like whoever you're sitting with and whoever is your panel or peers, they'll help you if you feel like you're stumbling. And yeah, I think like it's always an in-process thing.
I have one last question from, we have 5 minutes left. Someone asked, and that sparked a lot of like discussion that I loved in the chat, about IB visual art during high school. So they took IB visual art during high school and they had a lot of practice with critique. Is that similar to what we're doing, or is it different? And they were wondering if critique is the same that is done in the baccalaureate in high school.
Is anyone super familiar with the International Baccalaureate format? I'm not actually, so I'm not exactly sure about the format of the IB critiques, but what I can also say is, again, you will see as many different methods of critique probably as you are people participating in the Zoom right now. So there isn't one prescribed method of critique in general, and there's definitely not a prescriptive method per discipline. It's also very much has to do with your instructor, with how they were taught, how the culture of a program. So you'll see it a number of different ways. One other thing I wanted to just say before we end soon is someone asked about whether or not they'll get the notes from their peers during of feedback if peers are offering feedback. One of the most important things you can do during a critique where there's multiple people is ask someone in your class if they'll take notes for you during that conversation, because it's really difficult to hear feedback and then prepare a response and make sure that you're getting all of that information at one time. So it's really helpful to just ask someone. Anything else?
That's all the questions we had.
Well, I can see that someone really, really wants to have you all unmute and say hello. So would you like to all unmute and say hello to us now?
I think we can do it. Now we can like break the system. It's the time.
Yeah, I can't figure out how to do that.
We have 2 minutes left. Are we gonna do it? We unmute everyone.
Hello.
Ready?
Yo.
How?
Oh, do we get the
Yo, this is crazy. Hey, what's up, you guys?
Hi.
Poppin'.
Oh,
Let's keep this going. Let's keep this going.
you know, this is
30
normally done in.
minute high train. Let's go.
Yo.
Hi.
Poppin', bros.
You have voices. You have faces.
We are real people.
Welcome to Pratt.
My name's Thomas.
Welcome each of you.
So I apologize ahead of time. I am responsible for this. I am the architect of chaos for this happening.
Oh, well, that's good.
I see it. I like it.
Sorry for my language earlier.
All of them
Play a piano right now.
I apologize for the non-Christian rhetoric.
No problem.
Elizabeth?
That's me.
Is that?
I'm the
Elizabeth
perpetrator. I'm very sorry.
I'm fine.
Excuse my language.
No problem.
Losing my art class.
I'm going to mute you all, actually. This is the end of our session. So thank you for coming. We are all honestly so excited that you're all joining us this semester. Welcome to Pratt. I get chills just seeing all of you. I can't wait to see all of you on campus as the world allows. And if you have questions or anything you want to follow up with, feel free to reach out to us. But enjoy the rest of your orientation.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sure, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Rest in pieces, y'all. Peace.
Thank you, Camille and Gaia.
Yeah, thank you guys. This is super fun.
Yeah,
Recording.
It's very helpful for me to think about this stuff too.
yeah.
Okay, we
Thank you.